You know the song. You've known it your whole life. But here's what nobody ever told you the artist who made it. They had hits, real hits, charted records, award-winning records, records that shaped the sound of entire cities and influenced artists who became legends themselves. And somewhere between the radio, the playlists, and the way history gets written, all of it disappeared. Not because the music wasn't good enough. The music was extraordinary. Because nobody thought to tell you it existed. That changes right now. These are 15 artists that the world decided to call one-hit wonders. And every single verdict is wrong. Number 15. Fontella Bass. Rescue Me. 1965. Play the first 2 seconds of this record for anyone on the planet and watch what happens to their face. They know it. Immediately. That horn intro. That groove. That voice arriving like she has been waiting her entire life to deliver this one performance. Rescue Me has been in the bloodstream of American popular culture for 60 years. Commercials, television, film soundtracks, nostalgia. Playlists. It is one of those records that feels less like a song and more like a shared memory, something the entire culture agreed to hold on to without ever discussing why. And almost nobody can tell you who sang it. Fontella Bass was a Chess Records artist. And before we go any further, understand what that means. Chess Records in the 1960s was not a minor label. It was the home of Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Chuck Berry, Etta James, and Buddy Guy. Getting signed to Chess meant you had been vetted by one of the most demanding and historically significant labels in the history of American music. Bass had roots that went deeper than the recording industry. Her grandmother was a sanctified church singer in St. Louis. Her mother was a gospel singer. Fontella grew up inside the music before she ever stepped into a professional context. Her voice was not trained in a conventional sense. It was formed by church, by community, by a tradition that demanded everything you had every time you opened your mouth. She had been performing professionally since her teenage years, recording, touring. Number 14. The Soul Survivors. Expressway to Your Heart, 1967. Here is a test. Play this record for someone. Watch their body language change the second that groove kicks in. Watch them nod, lean forward, maybe mouth the words because everyone knows this song. It is that familiar. It is that deep in the muscle memory of anyone who grew up around soul music. Now ask them who made it. The silence will tell you everything. The Soul Survivors were not outsiders who stumbled into a recording studio and got lucky. They were embedded in the early Philadelphia soul scene at a moment when that scene was still determining what it was going to become. And the people in their orbit were not minor figures. Kenny Gamble was already connected to their world. From that name requires a moment of context for anyone who doesn't immediately recognize it. Kenny Gamble, alongside Leon Huff, would go on to co-found Philadelphia International Records, the label that gave the world the OJs, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Billy Paul, Teddy Pendergrass, the 3 Degrees. A catalog of records that defined the sound of American soul music for the entire decade of the 1970s. That infrastructure, that sound, was being built in the same rooms, at the same time, by the same network of musicians and producers who were working alongside the Soul Survivors when Expressway to Your Heart was recorded. They followed it with Explosion, In Your Soul. They were not finished. They had not run out of ideas. They were part of a creative ecosystem that was growing rapidly around them. Well, what happened to the Soul Survivors is not a story about talent running dry. It is a story about timing. But before we go any further, if nobody ever told you about this channel, think about how close you came to never finding this. Don't let that happen to somebody else, and don't let it happen to you again. Hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, because where we're going next in this story, you cannot afford to tap out. All right, now back to it. Number 13, Clarence Carter. Patches, 1970. There are records that entertain. There are records that move you. And then there are records that demand something from you, that grab you by the collar and refuse to let you be passive while they play. Patches is the third kind. It opens with a spoken word passage, a father on his deathbed calling his eldest son to his side, laying out the weight of what he is leaving behind, a struggling family, a hardscrabble life. The specific crushing instructions of a man who knows he's not going to be there to carry the load anymore. It is not a comfortable record. It is not supposed to be. It is a piece of American storytelling that happens to have a groove underneath it. It won the Grammy Award for Best Rhythm and Blues Song in 1971. The Recording Academy, not an institution historically known for its generosity toward raw, uncompromising soul music, looked at every R&B record released that year and said, "This one. This is the best of its kind." And most people who encounter it today treat Clarence Carter like he got lucky once. Let's correct that immediately. Clarence Carter was an Atlantic Records artist. He had been recording and charting for years before Patches ever crossed over to pop audiences. Slip Away, in 1968, was a top 10 R&B record. Not a minor placement, not a footnote. A genuine, significant chart hit that established Carter as a working, credible soul artist with an audience that was already paying attention. Too Weak to Fight followed and charted as well. He was a consistent presence on the R&B charts, the charts that black radio was built around, long before white pop audiences discovered him through Patches. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout this entire list. A black artist spends years building a career on the R&B charts. Then one record crosses over. Pop audiences hear it, embrace it, and immediately construct a narrative where that record is the beginning and the end of the story. The years of work that preceded it become invisible because those audiences were not present for them. Clarence Carter had already been great when Patches arrived. The Grammy confirmed what the R&B audience already knew. Pop audiences were just late to the conversation. Number 12, Joe Tex. Skinny Legs and All, 1967. Let's be completely direct about what is happening with this entry, because it requires a different kind of argument than most of the artists on this list. Joe Tex is not underrated in a minor technical sense. Joe Tex is underrated in a way that represents a genuine failure of how the history of soul music gets told. And the primary reason for that failure is sitting right here, in the title of this entry. A novelty record, a song with a punchline, a groove built around a joke about a woman's legs at a party. It is a great record. Funny, propulsive, irresistibly playful. It does exactly what it sets out to do. But the moment a casual listener hears a funny song, a specific thing happens in their brain. They categorize the artist. They file them under Novelty Act and close the drawer. And everything that came before and after the joke becomes invisible. Here is what was in that drawer. Hold What You've Got in 1965. A top 5 pop record. Soulful, direct, emotionally serious, nothing novelty about it. That was Joe Tex before Skinny Legs. Already charting, already significant. A Sweet Woman Like You followed. Show Me followed that. He was building a body of work, a consistent run of charting singles
With the skinny legs. Stand right there, baby. I'm gonna give you away in a minute.
that established him as one of the serious voices of the mid-60s soul scene. And then, in 1972, 5 full years after Skinny Legs and All, he came back with I Gotcha and went top 5 pop again. Not a nostalgia act writing a legacy.
Get it closed. Man just forgot to get his suit out the cleaners. That's all.
Not a comeback story built on sympathy. A working artist who had never actually stopped working, delivering another hit to audiences who apparently needed reminding that he was still there. There is also a dimension of Joe Tex's legacy that almost never gets discussed in mainstream music history. The performance style, the physicality, the direct, confrontational, deeply entertaining way he engaged with a live audience. The showmanship that made his concerts something people talked about long after they happened. James Brown gets and deserves enormous credit for inventing that performance language.
Yeah, it's better, come on, than any.
Number 11. The Astors. Candy, 1965. Say that name out loud. The Astors. Watch what happens in the room. Even among serious soul music listeners, people who can name Stax session musicians, who can distinguish between the Memphis and Chicago soul sounds by ear, who have strong opinions about the relative merits of different Atlantic Records producers, even among those people, the Astors will produce a pause. A moment of searching, a face that says the name is familiar, but the full picture is just out of reach. And that pause is the entire argument. The Astors were on Stax Records. In 1965, that addressed the studio on McLemore Avenue in Memphis was one of the most creatively significant locations in American music. The sound being built there was raw and live and physically immediate in a way that was the deliberate opposite of the polished orchestrated Motown aesthetic. It was guitar-driven, rhythm section forward. Emotionally direct in a way that demanded a response from your body before it asked anything of your mind. But Stax in that era had Otis Redding. They had Sam and Dave. They had Booker T and the MGs serving as the house band and anchoring the entire sonic identity of the label. They had Wilson Pickett recording there. They had Carla Thomas. They had a roster of talent so concentrated that being a genuinely excellent artist at Stax in 1965 was not enough to guarantee that the promotional machinery would point in your direction. Candy is a perfect piece of Memphis soul. Every element in its right place. The rhythm section locked in. The vocals direct and emotionally specific. The arrangement serving the song without overwhelming it. It is exactly what Stax sounded like when it was at its best, and it deserved to be heard by far more people than it reached. Number 10. The Swingin' Medallions. Double Shot of My Baby's Love. 1966. No qualifications necessary on this record. No context required. It is one of the great pure party records of the 1960s top 20 pop. Irresistible from the first downbeat. The kind of track that ends up on every cookout playlist, every road trip mix, every jukebox, in every bar that has decent taste. And the band that made it has been almost completely forgotten. Outside of a specific region of the American South. Here is the part of the story that the national narrative misses entirely. The Swingin' Medallions were not a studio creation. They were not a manufactured act assembled to deliver a single and then dissolve. They were a live band, a real working... Our touring group with a genuine following across the Southeast, who had been building an audience through performance long before Double Shot ever reached national radio. They continued recording after the hit. They continued performing. They did not pack up and go home when the chart moment passed. The work continued. The shows continued. The relationship with their regional audience continued. What happened to them is a phenomenon that affects a specific category of artist in this era with uncomfortable regularity. A regional act with a real following breaks nationally on the strength of one record. The national audience embraces the song, but they have no context for it, no relationship with the band's history, no sense of what existed before and what was being built alongside it. The song is all they have. So when the song fades from the charts, the artist fades with it in the national memory at least. Meanwhile, back in the South, the Swingin' Medallions are still on stage, still drawing the crowds who understood from the very beginning the double shot was not the whole story. It was just the chapter that everyone else finally showed up for. The national memory got it wrong. The regional audience always knew better. Number 9. Eddie Floyd. Knock on Wood, 1966. Before we talk about what Eddie Floyd accomplished, we need to talk about what happened to his most famous song. Because it is one of the more remarkable cases of identity displacement in the history of popular music and understanding. It is essential to understanding why Floyd's career has been so thoroughly overlooked. Knock on Wood was written by Eddie Floyd and Steve Cropper. If that second name sounds familiar, it should. Steve Cropper was the guitarist for Booker T and the MG's The Stax House Band, one of the most recorded and most influential rhythm sections in the history of American music. He co-wrote Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay with Otis Redding. He co-wrote In the Midnight Hour with Wilson Pickett. His fingerprints are on some of the most important records of the 1960s. Knock on Wood was a genuine R&B hit for Eddie Floyd in 1966. It crossed over. It got played. It became one of those records that people associate immediately with the Stax sound at its most essential.
Everybody clap your hands.
Then Amie Stewart recorded a disco version in 1979. And that version was so successful, so perfectly calibrated for the moment it landed in, so immediately embraced by the audiences who heard it, that an entire generation came to believe the song had always been hers. They heard Stewart's version first. They loved it, and the information that it was a cover, that there was an original, that the original had been made by a man named Eddie Floyd at Stax Records 13 years earlier. That information simply never arrived. And Eddie Floyd became invisible inside his own signature record. But even if you set that aside entirely, even if you know the original, Number 8. Chairman of the Board. Patches. 1970. Yes. 2 songs called Patches. Same year. Both hits. Both forgotten.
So, every morning before I went to school, I figured.
Clarence Carter was number 13 on this list. This is number 8. We are not repeating ourselves. We are making a point about how thoroughly an era can be buried when nobody is paying attention to it. Chairman of the board was General Johnson's group on Invictus Records. And before we even get to the music,
Every night I heard my mama cry, Lord.
The label itself deserves a moment. Invictus was founded by Holland Dozier Holland, the songwriting and production team responsible for a significant portion of Motown's greatest records. Stop, in the name of love. You can't hurry love. Reach out, I'll be there.
Passed away, and I became a man that day, so.
How sweet it is to be loved by you. They wrote and produced records for the Four Tops, the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, and Martha, and the Vandellas. They left Motown in a royalty dispute and founded their own label. The pedigree behind Invictus Records was not minor.
Pastor, son, you better come on in and your daddy wants to see.
It was extraordinary, and chairman of the board was one of that label's flagship acts. Now here is what most people do not know about their chart history. Give Me Just a Little More Time came out in 1970, the same year as their version of Patches, and reached the top 5 on the pop charts.
Me, you, and I, every day of our life.
Not a minor placement, a genuine mainstream hit that was in the national conversation simultaneously with the song that would eventually overshadow everything else the group had done. Everything's Tuesday charted. Pay to the Piper charted. General Johnson had a voice that was immediately distinctive warm.
Life's mountain. Every day of my life I'm trying to climb life's mountain.
Slightly melancholy, deeply soulful, in a way that resisted easy categorization. That distinctiveness should have been an asset over a long career. It made him unforgettable to the listeners who found him, but it also made him difficult to slot into a simple marketing narrative.
Get up, life will kick you back down, and that day, Papa called me to it.
Which in the music industry of that era was sometimes enough to get you left behind. Chairman of the board had a full run, multiple charting singles, a label with legitimate pedigree, creative momentum that was producing real results. By every reasonable definition of the phrase, they were not a one-hit wonder. They were a group that the industry narrative chose not to carry forward, and the distinction matters.
At 13, I felt like I was carrying away the whole world. See,
Number 7. Jerry Butler. Moody Woman. 1969. If you were building a case for the single most underappreciated career in the history of soul music, if you had to stand up in front of a room and argue for one artist who has been most consistently, most unfairly reduced in the public memory, Jerry Butler is a legitimate candidate for that title. And the fact that he appears on a list like this one, in the context of one-hit wonder corrections, is itself a kind of evidence for the argument. Start at the beginning.
My life would be much tougher if I didn't have you.
Not at his solo career. Before that, Jerry Butler co-founded The Impressions with Curtis Mayfield. Before he had a single hit under his own name, before he had stepped into a studio as a solo artist, he was part of one of the most important vocal groups in the history of soul and gospel-influenced popular music.
Oh, variety's the spice of life. Yes, the pain.
The group that would go on to record People Get Ready, Keep on Pushing, Amen, We're a Winner, songs that were not just chart successes but cultural documents, music that was directly tied to the civil rights movement and the broader transformation of Black American life in the 1960s. Jerry Butler was there at the beginning of that. He was a founder of that. Then in 1960, he released He Will Break Your Heart as a solo artist, and it went to number 1 on the pop charts, not the R&B charts, the pop charts. The mainstream. Jerry Butler had a number 1 record before most of the artists on this entire list had recorded their first professional single. Then came a difficult stretch, several years where the momentum was harder to maintain, where the hits were not coming with the same consistency. Where the industry's attention moved to other names. This is the period where most artists either disappear or compromise, start chasing whatever is working for someone else, sand down the edges, become something more manageable. Jerry Butler did neither. He recalibrated. In the late 1960s, Number 6. Gene Knight, Mr. Big Stuff. 1971. There are opening bass lines in the history of soul music that are so immediately, so physically recognizable
The big stuff. Tell me, who do you think you are?
that they function less like musical information and more like a reflex trigger. You hear the first note, and your body is already responding before your brain has finished processing what is happening. Mr. Big Stuff has one of those bass lines. 2 seconds in, and you already know exactly where you are. The groove locks in. The attitude is established. And then Jean Knight arrives, and she is not asking. She is not hoping. She is making a declaration, and the record gives her every inch of space she needs to make it count. It reached number 2 on the pop charts, and number 1 on the R&B charts. For a record that specific in its attitude, that direct in its challenge to a certain kind of man, those chart numbers are not just commercial data. They are evidence that the audience heard exactly what she was saying and responded with an enthusiastic yes. John Knight is almost exclusively discussed in the context of this one record. Ask a casual music fan about her career, and they will tell you she made one great song and then disappeared. The story, as usually told, begins and ends with Mr. Big Stuff. That is not the complete story.
I know you broke their hearts one after another, now bit by bit.
Knight continued recording through the 1970s. You Think You're Hot Stuff found an audience. She was not idle. She was not finished. And then in 1981, a full decade after Mr. Yeah, Big Stuff charted, she came back with My Toot Toot. A Louisiana swamp pop record that became a genuine regional phenomenon with real national chart traction. That is not the arc of a one-hit wonder. That is the arc of an artist who kept working, kept recording, kept finding ways to connect with audiences for 20 years. And across multiple distinct musical styles. There is also a dimension of Jean Knight's story that sits inside the larger history of how black women in the soul era were compensated for their work. Mr. Big Stuff was a significant commercial success. The revenues it generated over 50 plus years of licensing. Number 5. The Stylistics. Betcha by Golly Wow. 1972. This entry requires a slightly different argument, because the Stylistics are not unknown. They are not buried. People love the Stylistics. Their music has never stopped being played, never stopped being sampled, never stopped showing up in the cultural conversation in ways that prove the emotional power of what they made. Russell Tompkins Jr.'s falsetto is one of the most recognizable voices in the history of soul music. That is not an overstatement. That is a fact. So the argument here is not that the Stylistics have been forgotten. The argument is that casual listeners have fundamentally and consistently underestimated the scope and consistency of what they accomplished. They are loved for 2 songs by people who think they are being generous. They are not being generous. They are missing the majority of the story. Here is the majority of the story. Between 1971 and 1975, the Stylistics had 7 top 10 pop hits. 7 in 4 years. On the pop charts, not just the R&B charts, where their dominance was even more complete. You Are Everything. Betcha by Golly Wow. People Make the World Go Round. I'm Stone in Love with You. Break Up to Make Up. You'll Never Get to Heaven. Rock and Roll Baby. 7 top 10 pop hits. That is not a group riding a moment. That is a dynasty. That is one of the most consistent commercial and artistic runs of the entire decade. And behind that run, Number 4. Lonnie Liston Smith. Expansions. 1975. To understand how expansions happen to understand why it sounds the way it sounds and carries the weight that it carries. You have to understand where Lonnie Liston Smith came from. And where he came from is one of the most remarkable musical resumes of the 20th century. Before he ever released a record under his own name, Lonnie Liston Smith had played piano and keyboards with Miles Davis. Let that establish a baseline. Miles Davis in this era was not operating in the mainstream. He was at the outer edges of what jazz could be pushing against every conventional expectation, surrounding himself exclusively with musicians who could follow him into completely uncharted territory. Liston Smith followed him there. He had also worked with Pharoah Sanders, the saxophonist, whose collaborations with John Coltrane had pushed the spiritual and sonic possibilities of jazz to their furthest boundaries. With Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, with Joe Williams, with Galt McDermott, the composer behind Hair. He was not a newcomer when Expansions arrived. He was a deeply experienced musician who had spent years operating at the absolute highest levels of jazz and experimental music before stepping forward as a bandleader under his own name. Expansions itself is a record that defies simple categorization. And that quality is part of what has made it so enduring and so influential. It is jazz. It is funk. It is soul. It has a meditative and an almost spiritual quality that feels connected to the free jazz and consciousness-expanding musical movements of the era, while remaining completely accessible to listeners who had no formal relationship with any of those traditions. It became a soul jazz standard. It became a club record, and eventually, inevitably, Number 3. Patrice Rushen. Forget-Me-Nots, 1982. If you wanted to construct a perfect case study, a single, comprehensive example of every way an artist can be reduced, mislabeled, and stripped of credit, you would not need to construct anything. You would just point to Patrice Rushen and say, look at this. This is what it looks like. Every element is here. The extraordinary talent arriving early, the long career preceding the hit that consumes everything before it. The sample that rewrites the public memory, and underneath all of it, an artist of such genuine, documented, remarkable ability that the reduction becomes almost surreal when you understand the full picture. She won the Montreux Jazz Festival competition at 17 years old. Not participated, not placed respectably. 1. Against adult professional musicians who had spent years developing their craft. At 17, a teenage pianist from Los Angeles who had clearly been operating at a professional level long before the industry had any formal framework for understanding what she was. That is where the story of Patrice Rushen begins. Not with a pop hit, not with a sample, with a jazz festival competition in Switzerland that she entered as a teenager and walked away from as the winner. She had been recording and charting since the mid-1970s. Hang it up. Haven't you heard a lush, sophisticated R&B record with jazz overtones that charted in 1979 and demonstrated a range and a musical intelligence that went well beyond what most pop producers were working with? Settle for My Love. These were real records with real chart placements on black radio, not underground collector's items, not deep album cuts, but singles that her audience found and responded to. Forget-Me-Nots came out in 1982 and was a genuine pop and R&B crossover. Number 2. The Chi-Lites. Have You Seen Her? 1971. Eugene Record is one of the great unsung songwriters and producers of the soul era. That is not a minor claim.
But today, again I rise.
That is a statement about one of the most gifted craftsmen in a decade, absolutely overflowing with gifted craftsmen, and it is a statement that the mainstream music conversation has failed to make loudly enough for 50 years. The Chi-Lites are the vehicle through which Record did his most significant work. And the casual listener's relationship to that work is almost always incomplete in the same specific way they know one song, maybe two, and they assume the story is told. Have You Seen Her is the song most people know first, the spoken word introduction, the melancholy groove. The narrative of a man watching a woman on the street and being flooded with memories of the one he lost. It is precisely, deliberately, almost surgically constructed to make you feel a specific kind of ache, and it works every single time, on every kind of listener. Regardless of their relationship to soul music. That is not an accident. That is Eugene Record understanding exactly what he is doing. But here is what most people do not know. In the same 12-month stretch that Have You Seen Her was on the charts, the same stretch the Chi-Lites also had, Oh Girl. Oh Girl reached number 1 on the pop charts in 1972. Not the R&B charts, the pop charts. Mainstream America, number 1. A record built on the most minimal possible arrangement, Eugene Record's own voice, an acoustic guitar. Giant and a string arrangement of breathtaking restraint. Nothing extra, nothing decorative, just the song and the voice and the space to let both of them breathe. Number 1. And the Chi-Lites did not stop there. Number 1. The Delphonics. Didn't I blow your mind this time? 1970. This record won the Grammy Award for Best Rhythm and Blues Song in 1971. Let that land completely before we move forward. Not a nomination, not a recognition from a smaller institution with a narrower reach. The Grammy for Best Rhythm and Blues Song, against every other R&B record released in that year. In 1970, was not a thin year for soul music. It was one of the richest, most creatively dense years in the history of the form, and the Recording Academy looked at all of it and said this one, the Delphonics. This is the best, and the majority of people who encounter this group today treat them like a trivia question. Like a sample source, like a name that sounds familiar, but whose full story they have never been curious enough to find. The story is this: the Delphonics' 1968 single, La La Means I Love You, is not just a great record. It is a foundational record. One of the defining documents of what the Philadelphia soul sound was going to become. It arrived before Philadelphia International Records existed as a formal entity. It arrived before Tom Bell had fully articulated the production language that would go on to define an entire decade of American music. In a very real sense, La La was the record that proved the language was possible. Tom Bell built his identity as a producer, the specific relationship between strings and voices, the way orchestration could support and amplify rather than simply surround. The Philadelphia sound that would become one of the most recognized and influential aesthetics in the history of popular music, on the foundation he developed in those early sessions with William Hart and the Delphonics. Everything that came after traces a direct line back to that room. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the Stylistics, who appear on this very list at number 5, the OJs, Teddy Pendergrass,